All right. But yeah, I um I watched the 30 for 30 last night,
Yeah.
and I was, there's a lot of me and it's funny because because I've been boxing a lot of hang on, I got an echo. It's funny because but me and Tommy were a lot more similar than I thought,
Yeah.
just with the work in construction when you were a kid, and and
Yeah.
in the boxing, and it's just it's a shame what happened and all that stuff. So, but yeah,
Yeah.
I so you don't think that he died of AIDS? I watched what you think, but if you want to go ahead and explain that, how you felt he actually passed, go.
Right. Well, Johnny, thank you for having me on your show. I guess we're live right now,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Good to meet you. It's nice to have somebody out there that wants to spread the truth. And so when I messaged you, I asked if you were a truth spreader, and you responded yes. And that's all I needed, because that's all I'm trying to do. It's to answer your question just now, it's not me that thinks Tommy didn't die of AIDS. It's actually the physicians, the scientists that did all the testing on Tommy. Those are the ones that are sending out that message, and I'm just spreading the truth just like you. So I have enough evidence from them to be able to share with you today. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Feel free, and I especially back then in the '90s and stuff, when you get it, maybe got labeled with that, it was kind of a bad little bad stigmata. I could only imagine too. I mean,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, it's because back then, I mean, excuse my French, but back then it was, people thought it was only for gay guys and all that others, so I could only imagine
Right.
him. I could only imagine him having to go through that if people,
Yeah.
you know, you know,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to mention today, which I've not really covered in any interview, is not only was he labeled as having a horrendous, deadly disease, which in the end turns out that he never had, but also to be labeled as a felon all his life,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And he writes about that in one of his books that he wrote, Tommy, My Darkest Years. He wrote this. He found it was therapeutic. It's actually quite nice to read, because it's something that the media does not cover. Um, he talks about the drugs. When you're told you're going to die, you basically, live your life.
yeah,
And the people that gave him drugs, he says, actually, I'm going to read Tommy's words. I
yeah,
didn't have to buy drugs. Friends just gave them to me. I hung out with the wrong crowd. I thought they were friends. I never used to get involved in anything I could not walk away from. So, that's a problem that people seem to forget. You hang out with the wrong crowds, they give you drugs, it's gonna get you into trouble. He did prison time, as he writes in his book. He says, I went from two-time heavyweight champion of the world, co-star of Rocky Five, a very celebrated athlete, to prison inmate number 610788.
yeah,
I did 14 months, 8 days, 6 hours, and 46 minutes. It's sitting in solitary confinement for 120 days that I really started to think about all the time I lost being in there. I don't belong here, he said. Um,
Miss Morrison, it's crazy because I am a felon. I get the stigmata of I know all about that. hanging around with the wrong, the first time I got arrested for the first time when I was 15 years old. So I'm not a bad person by any means, but like you said,
Yeah.
being around the wrong crowd with the drugs floating around, it's just a destructive path that you gotta, kind of find your way out of. And especially when you're, on the dying, or you think you're gonna die, or it's
Yeah.
probably like, I don't, you got kind of get the I don't care anymore mentality too, so I
Yeah.
completely understand it. I'm
Yeah.
myself, I'm still on parole,
Yeah.
so it's tough, man, that nobody wants to be around you. You're labeled as a criminal.
Yeah.
It's just a tough thing to find yourself out of. So I've been there.
Yeah.
Completely understand it.
Yeah, and he has no problem writing about it. He has no problem telling people that that's what he went through. He went through drugs. He went and hung out with the wrong crowd. He served prison time,
Yeah.
but he also wanted people to know that he did turn himself around as well, and that it's possible to do that. And that's one of the things where you watch that ESPN 30 for 30 documentary.
Mm,
That, to me, they knew that Tommy had done drug rehab in the last 5 years of his life. They knew that, and yet they didn't display that on their documentary that's gone out to at least 164 million people.
yeah.
But it just gave no hope to anybody out there doing drugs. Once you're labeled a felon, once you're labeled a drug addict, that's it. You're just going to die, just like Tommy Morrison. And his choices, it was what he did to himself. But I'm trying to get the truth out there. I'm trying to tell people, look, you know what? He did make bad choices, but he grew up in a family where there were drugs, there was drink, there was bad behavior, and he tried to get away, from that as a kid, and he was not always successful because of the friends that he hung around with. Even his father mentioned to him, stop hanging around with those kids. They don't care about, your career. They just want to hang out with a heavyweight champion and get him drunk and steal his money. He writes in his book, Tommy writes, no one would offer me a job. I was a liability. So in the end, he became and felt that he was a liability to people. And that was just very sad because in the last few years, he did do drug rehab. He did turn his life around. And people need to know that you do have to drop those so-called friends that are not really your friends if you want to turn your life around.
When I was a teenager, I moved from Illinois to Wisconsin, and I kind of had a reputation already as, like, because I
Yeah,
boxed and did karate and all this other stuff. So I would always get tested, and I'd always get into fights and stuff like that. And then eventually, that same crowd becomes
yeah,
my friends, but they're not really your friends. I was, and like I said, and like Tommy, I was working construction from a young age as well.
yeah,
And, so when you're around a bunch of poor kids and you're the only one with the job and trying to do something with themselves, they're going to feed off you. They're going to leech off you, man. And they're just going to kind of
right,
bring you down with them. And that's obviously never a good situation to be in, so
right.
yeah.
That's right. And then they're going to disappear.
And then
You
they're going to,
know,
yeah.
when you really need their help, they disappear. So one of the things that Tommy did was he did do drug rehab. And he had tried drug rehab several times before he and I met and never succeeded. People actually, his friends would come and visit him at drug rehab and they would bring him drugs in the drug rehab. I mean, what do you say about that? That is just totally disgraceful. So he did. There was one time when he came back from a filming that he had to do in LA, and I met him at the airport, and I bought a drug test, right, from Walgreens.
Yeah.
And I meet him, and he gets in the car, and I said, "We're not moving. You need to pee in this cup right now."
Yeah.
Right? And it's me talking to a heavyweight boxing champion of the world, telling him that we're not moving until he pees in that cup, right?
Yeah.
And he looks at me, and he does what I tell him. He pees in the cup, and I get the little test thing, and I look at it, and I've never done this before to anybody, so I'm kind of looking at the test strip to what the results are, and I'm looking at him, and I'm going, no way. You know, you need to decide right now what you're going to do. You either carry on doing all these things that this is saying that is in your system, or you change your way of life
Yeah.
and start doing drug rehab. And I didn't move the car, Johnny, until he made that decision, right?
Yeah.
And of course, I was shaking, thinking, "Oh my God, should I even be doing this?" Um, he decided to do drug rehab. And one of the things he had to do was he had to delete all those so called friends from his cell phone. And all those so called friends hate me to this day, right? Because he just totally just departed from them. And he would go to drug rehab every day. There would be some excuse, Johnny, why he couldn't go that day. We wouldn't put up with it. We got the car out. He went in the car, took him to drug rehab. And, the very first test result that he had was not that great, right?
Yeah.
And then the second one was, the third one was, and the very first one where everything was clear on that drug rehab report, he made photocopies of it, right? He put it everywhere in the house, in his pocket. He would show people, and he was just so proud of that moment. His head was so clear. He was the most sober in his life, perhaps.
Yeah.
And then he did start to, you know, still go to classes, and he'd sit in class, and he'd look at one kid, and he'd go, "You know what? I know what you're going to do next. Don't go there, right? Because if you do, you're going to end up back on the streets again." And they all looked up to him because they knew that he had gone through what they were going through. And he was trying to make an effort to change things around. And he did. He did his drug rehab, and yet the media won't say that. They won't show that he was successful in doing that. And I don't understand why not, right? Johnny, explain to me why not.
Well, and that's terrible, because you would think that they, for all the negative stuff they put out there, that they would put something positive out there. That
Yeah,
towards the end, he made a good effort and a good account of himself to, get clean and, try to change his ways and turn his stuff around. It took me, because I'm 6 years clean off of heroin myself,
right.
and I still have a little trouble with the drinking too, and to this day I do. But it took me going to, I just like you mentioned, I had to delete all the phone numbers,
Yeah,
friends, girlfriends, etc. I moved to Florida for a couple of years. It took me to just change the whole environment, sit me down, be around a new group of people for a little while. Then when I came back, have a little bit of a fresh start there. So like I said,
yeah.
it's a big hump to get over, but it can be done.
It it can be done. Tommy elaborates in his book here how the drugs affected him. And literally he tried everything. But you have to remember that he was in the most depressed part of his whole life. He's been told he's got HIV. He's been told he's going to die by the time he gets to his car. His reputation is stripped from him in the blink of an eye, he said, and his whole profession was taken from him, and he was basically treated like a leper. So he turned, and he always used to say this, he turned to drugs to fill a void. And that void was that his whole life was a mess. And he couldn't wait to turn to drugs because then that would lead to falling asleep and then waking up again. It was like a vicious cycle for him, right? Um, but the fact that he was able to finally kick it, I think is just, just amazing. And the media does not report anything good on Tommy Morrison. Tommy died 10 years ago. It's 2023 now for anybody that's watching this interview. Tommy died September 1, 2013. That's 10 years. And yet the media will still pull up. He's a disgraceful heavyweight, right? He made bad choices. They don't see how he turned himself around. They, for some reason, don't seem to accept lab reports from, scientists that show his post-mortem actually came back negative for HIV and negative for AIDS. So it's an interesting life Tommy Morrison had. And the truth is getting out there now. People like you, Johnny, that have lived a life like Tommy, and then you've got all his fans. One thing Tommy did say one night was, this was back in 2011, he said, "I fought for my fans. Would they fight for me?"
Yeah,
Right?
sure.
So when you said that the media, why isn't the media showing good stuff about him? Well, it's actually now the fans. The fans are fighting for him. You're fighting for him. And that's perhaps even more important than what the media is putting out there, because the media right now is totally silent about the post-mortem report. But the fans are out there screaming and fighting for him.
Yeah, even this is my buddy right here. He even said, "But the boxing media sucks." But
Yeah.
as far as the media goes, especially with the boxing media, but and some of the sports, a lot of these guys that do cover the sports and stuff, they're guys that grew up in Vegas and grew up in New York, and
Yeah.
and grew up in New York and California. It's completely different when you're a poor kid from the South or the Midwest, like me and Tommy.
Yeah.
You get a bunch of money thrown at you. Of course, you're going to go crazy. Of course, you're going to have your fun, man. I mean,
Right.
that's just, and then you get, like you say, and then you make a couple of bad decisions, and,
Yeah.
it's hooked with you forever. And it's just, that's awful. I wouldn't
Right.
want that
That's
happen.
right. I mean, the media followed him around as this heavyweight, but let's not forget that he was between 20 and 26 years old. He is still a kid, right? He is still a young guy going out with women and having fun with his so-called friends. That's normal. That's a normal life, really, for a 20-year-old.
Right.
But he was under the limelight, right? And but you have to look at the timeline of his life between 20 and 26. It was all boxing. Of course, it was Rocky Five, and how good he was and how bad the movie was. They still come out with both sides of that. And then the media comes out with all his fights, how good he was, the left hook, right? And the Razor Ruddock fight. You see some of the belts here. There's all his belts.
Yeah.
Um, but then everything stops on February 10th, 1996. That's it. He's done, right?
Yeah.
So, and a lot of the documentaries are out there, the rise and the fall. Well, wait a minute. Yeah, there was a rise. Yeah, he was knocked down, but he wasn't out, as they say on that Rocky movie.
Yeah.
And by the time he did die, he actually had turned himself around and had opened a gym for kids in the poorest, dangerous neighborhood in Wichita, Kansas. So, but the media won't report on that. But yeah, I heard from a journalist once, and he said, if I report on the truth about Tommy Morrison, I would be committing journalist suicide.
Yeah, that's, again, the guys, a lot of the guys in the media, they like to focus on the one bad thing you did instead of the three good things you did.
Yeah,
That's it's kind of it's hypocritical, and it's kind of BS, and it's a damn shame. My buddy had a question for you, and I know because I've watched some of your interviews, but just my buddy Giuseppe, he said, so was Tommy misdiagnosed? If so, can his family possibly sue the doctors that diagnosed him with HIV for that? That's got malpractice written all over it. So you can kind of
yeah.
elaborate.
Um, yeah, to answer that question, and I'll go through some documents with you now so that he can see that.
Yeah.
It would be good to be able to sue the doctor that diagnosed Tommy with HIV. It's just that nobody diagnosed him with HIV, Johnny. In Vegas, when Tommy died, um, he died on September 1, 2013,
Yeah.
and the physician asked me, would I like an autopsy, a post-mortem? And I said, yes, absolutely. I want a post-mortem. I want you to show me the virus. If you find it, let's put it out there. Let's put it on the death certificate. Let's make it well known that yes, Tommy Morrison had the virus that causes AIDS. So on September 1, when he died, it was 11:50 p.m.
Mhm.
and they drew his blood and they took it off. They did a proper test requisition, it's called, where it's all properly signed off. There's a good chain of command so that you know exactly where it went from here to there and everywhere. Right.
Right.
So it was definitely Tommy's blood. It wasn't, his father's, his brothers, his sons, the promoters. It wasn't anybody else's except for Tommy's own blood.
Yeah.
Um, September 2nd, and that's why I always say the timeline is really important. September 2nd, 2013, the media went crazy. Tommy was diagnosed with HIV on February 10th, 1996, and was kicked out of boxing. And on September 1, 2013, died of AIDS. Well, that sounds very good. That sounds what it should be, right? You
Right.
know, if he got diagnosed with HIV in Vegas to kick him out of boxing for the rest of his life, then of course when he dies, and there's no other reason for it, of course he's died of AIDS. Well, back up here. The post-mortem isn't done yet. So September 17th, 2013, the scientist and physician in Nebraska calls me and he says, Mrs. Morrison, and I go, yeah. And he starts to stutter. He goes, I don't understand, but he's negative for HIV. And I went, okay. And I did it calmly because it's what Tommy always said, right? And I said, okay, can you send me proof of that? Send me a report. And he said, yeah. And you could hear he was, shaken, right? And so on the 24th of September, I received the postmortem. In,
Mhm.
sci- in scientific terms, it showed that he had no retroviruses in him. A retrovirus is the scientific term for HIV. So here I am in the middle of the whole world, where everybody's saying, oh, Tommy Morrison, shame on him, he shouldn't have messed around, he got HIV, he died of AIDS. And I'm going, whoa, wait, I just got the post-mortem and he didn't have HIV, right? But by then it was already out there.
Right.
They did their job. And then when ESPN 30 for 30 came 2 years later, actually 2017, 3 years later,
Yeah.
um, they came and sat down with me for about 3 hours. And I went through everything, like I'm going to go through with you, Johnny.
Yeah.
Showed them the post-mortem, showed them negative for HIV, showed them negative for AIDS diseases, showed them negative for marijuana, cocaine, and all that. I
Yeah.
sat down 3 hours with them, and they didn't include any of that,
That
right?
that's bullshit. Yeah,
Uh,
that's
They could have done, they could have spread the truth. They could have said, okay, rise, fall, rise again. This is how it really ended for Tommy Morrison. No HIV, no AIDS, no drugs, turned himself around, but they didn't do that. Um, so when I received that post-mortem, I contacted the physician in Vegas. As you said, everything happens in Vegas, right?
yeah.
And I asked him, Johnny, I said, you better have good medical malpractice, just like your friend was asking there on that question.
Yeah.
And I the
Well,
scientist that did the post-mortem said he did not have HIV. And so through his attorney, he replies back, I never diagnosed Tommy with HIV. And this is the physician in 1996 that's still alive in 2013. He says, I never diagnosed Tommy with HIV. I found him medically and physically fit to fight and box that night. So I was shocked, right? Here I am trying to find the physician that diagnosed Tommy with HIV, and it was not him. He did not diagnose him. So, to cut a very long story short, I filed a lawsuit in Vegas, and I thought I had chosen the right people for the lawsuit, because I was searching for who was the physician that diagnosed Tommy with HIV in 1996,
right.
um, which I think all of us have heard. That's where it happened in Vegas in
Right.
1996. So I took the Nevada Commission to court, along with Mark Ratner, who was the executive commissioner, Dr. Margaret Goodman, who does all the VADA, the anti-doping, association,
I've heard the name. I've heard the name.
right? Yeah, real tough lady. So three of those, which are called the state defendants in this case, and then I took Quest Diagnostics, which was the lab that did the so-called testing in Vegas, and also a Dr. John Hyatt, who had been referred in the media as the physician that had diagnosed Tommy with HIV and had reviewed his results of 1996.
Right. Yeah.
During the lawsuit, I come to find that this Dr. John Hyatt was not even a doctor, and was not even a pathologist. So that was a shame, because I wanted to find the physician, right? In this lawsuit,
Yeah.
there's a document that's available that anybody can pull up, and it's July 27th, 2016. You're talking about 20 years later, Johnny, right?
Right.
It's document 217. Let me read you what the Nevada Commission's attorney wrote. This honorable court should not lose sight of the fact that no one diagnosed Mr. Morrison with HIV on February 10, 1996.
Wow. That's yeah. That's that. Well, if that you see, why were they so hell bent on saying that he had HIV then if he didn't have, you know, yeah, that's strange to put it lightly, you know,
Yeah.
because
That's coming from Vegas. That's
right,
coming from the state defendants, the Nevada Commission, from Mark Ratner, and from Dr. Margaret Goodman through their attorney, who happens to be the Attorney General in Nevada, right? Now they wouldn't write something like that, right? That if they thought somebody had diagnosed, then they should name them, right, in the lawsuit. Um, but then they also write in the same document, okay, so if he didn't have HIV, right, and nobody diagnosed him with HIV, why did they kick him out of boxing, right? Why
right,
did they not license him? Why did that fight, which was the first fight under Don King, right?
yeah,
Why did that not happen? Well, they carry on to say, um, uh, Mr. Morrison did not provide a completed application for an unarmed combatant's license, which is a professional boxing license.
Right. Yeah.
When he failed to provide proof that he was not carrying the HIV virus as required pursuant to NAC 467.027 Section 3. So, in other words, nobody diagnosed Tommy Morrison with HIV. Okay, so he didn't have HIV, but he never provided proof that he never had HIV. And it was required pursuant to a regulation. Okay, so this was back in 2016. And remember, I went through Nevada Federal Court, I went through the Ninth Circuit Court, I went through the US Supreme Court. I mean, I haven't stopped, right?
Yeah.
And went the rounds 3 times. And in 2020, I've looked up that rule that they're saying that Tommy violated, because first of all, they're saying nobody diagnosed Tommy with HIV. Okay, great. All right, so he violated this rule 467.027 Section 3B. So I look at that rule, and literally by contacting the Nevada legislator, right, and getting the proper documentation of a rule that is enforced in Vegas, all these, right? I mean, I paid for all this, and I wanted to see, okay, that rule that Tommy violated, what did it say? Well, that rule did not say that you had to provide any validation that you did or did not have HIV.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
So it's like, well, wait, so he didn't get diagnosed with HIV, and there was not a rule in place for him to have to prove that he didn't have HIV. So what's even more weird is that in some of the other court records, I contacted the lab, and they said that Quest Diagnostics, they also don't diagnose people, right? So Quest didn't diagnose, the commission didn't diagnose, Dr. Margaret Goodman didn't diagnose, Dr. John Hyatt was not a doctor. Okay, so where are we going with this, right?
Sure.
And then there's another document, it's Exhibit 0015 that the commission put out. It's dated July 11, 2006, which is 10 years later. Remember, he gets kicked out of boxing 1996, and it's lifting his suspension.
Oh, wow.
And did you know that? I mean, did the media tell you that?
No, not at all. See, I have a question real quick. So if he didn't have HIV and he didn't have to show proof of any of this, and he never got diagnosed, and he had his my question would be, what the hell was the agenda to keep him out of the sport then? That would be my big question. What was were they so desperate to keep him out of boxing?
Yeah, it is an interesting agenda.
Yeah.
They keep saying he failed to comply with a regulation, but that regulation didn't exist. They keep saying that they didn't diagnose.
Yeah.
So who told him he had HIV?
Right.
Right. Now you've watched ESPN 30 for 30, right?
Yeah.
Who told Tommy he had HIV?
Yeah, well, see, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but yeah, what was the motive?
Yeah, somebody told him, right?
And you couldn't
and
you couldn't find the doctor either, correct?
Right. Yeah. So in this lawsuit, I'm going, wait, are you sure nobody diagnosed Tommy with HIV in Vegas?
Yeah.
And so there is a document, docket 136, and it's from the CEO of the lab in 1996, Dr. Henry Soloway. And he goes, and this is all in court records under oath. He goes, I conclude that Mr. Morrison was never infected with the HIV virus. Okay, that is the CEO of the lab. Here is his affidavit, right?
Yeah.
And you can find that as well.
Wow.
Here, the Nevada Commission even go as far as saying in docket 174 in 2016, plaintiff, which is me, I'm the one that sued them, plaintiff now recognizes that neither the state defendants nor Quest defendants ever diagnosed Mr. Morrison as carrying the HIV virus, right? So that's in court records. Okay, they even go as far as saying in another court record, as stated numerous times, no diagnosis of HIV was made on February 10, 1996, or at any other time by any state defendants. Okay, here's the physician, and his name is Dr. Robert Voy. And the attorney for Dr. Robert Voy, who is this gentleman here, right? I have no problem putting their photos up there because there's court records to support this.
Yeah.
The Vegas Council says for Dr. Robert Voy, it is important for you to understand that Dr. Voy did not diagnose and never has diagnosed Mr. Morrison as HIV positive. And that's the physician. And then you've got another guy that does all the ringside tests and everything. And even he says he examined him and found him fit. And he put that on his affidavit. And then Dr. Margaret Goodman, right? I mean, these are the people I sued, right?
Yeah.
A question to her was, admit you, Dr. Margaret Goodman, can provide a document that confirms the diagnosis of the virus HIV in Tommy's blood on February 10, 1996. And she says, deny. She couldn't provide it, right? So I'm thinking, okay, this is great. You know, nobody is actually saying that they ever diagnosed him. So one thing that Tommy kept on saying was he never got anything in writing, right? He never got, he's saying, where's my report? Where's my lab report that says I've got HIV?
Right.
If you look back at ESPN 30 for 30, the one person telling Tommy he has HIV is Tony Holden, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. And Tony Holden is not a physician, right? And he has never seen the virus, as far as I know. He's never studied, medicine. And he didn't have a lab report at that time. And he states that in his deposition, and also in articles out there, that he was never given any proof from the lab of HIV, right? So in this lawsuit, there is an exhibit, and it is a lab report, right?
Yeah.
Now, okay, this is from Vegas, and it lists a physician's name, Robert Voy, who we've just mentioned, never diagnosed Tommy with HIV. It lists him as having drawn the blood and ordered the test. He didn't. He didn't order the blood test, and he never drew the blood. It lists Tommy as 99 years old. Obviously, Tommy was just 26, just turned 27, right? It lists a physician that they reported the results to, a Dr. Russell, who cannot find him at all listed as a physician. And in fact, the only Dr. Russell in Vegas retired in 1985. So what's he doing, if he is still alive there? And there's no signature on the bottom of the lab report.
So there's all kinds of falsified documents and misconceptions, and just, that's mind-blowing to me. That's,
yeah,
incorrect information, especially from doctors' reports and lab reports and all this stuff. That's supposed to be spot on accurate too. Yeah, you know, I mean,
Yeah, so to answer your friend's question, was he misdiagnosed? He was never diagnosed at all in Vegas with HIV. And I went a little bit further. Once I saw that lab report, I thought, oh, okay, so now we've got the evidence that Tommy was looking for and Tony Holden needed back in 1996, and it's just been produced almost 20 years later. Nobody's seen that report before. The commission had sworn under oath they'd never seen it. Tommy was still looking for it, and Tony Holden had never seen it either. So I asked a question. The tests on that lab report, were they FDA approved? You know,
right.
where are the clinical trials to say that that test even detected HIV and not some other random antibodies to an autoimmune disorder? Well, their response, the lab, was because despite reasonable inquiry, it has been meaning the lab, it has been unable to identify the exact model and manufacturer of the FDA approved confirmatory Western blot test that was in use. And in other words, they don't know what test was given,
Yeah,
right?
right, right.
And they don't have, they don't know what company, they don't even know whether that test detected HIV. And then the judge, and his name is Judge Richard F. Bulwer II, who was the fourth judge on this case, because the other three recused themselves. They took themselves off the case for some reason, right? So this is the fourth judge, and he goes, we wouldn't even be having this discussion, in other words, this lawsuit, if
Right.
the test was specific for the existence of the virus or not. That's obviously why there's even the possibility of a claim the tests didn't test for the virus, right? And
Yeah,
that's coming from the judge. There's no proof that that test tested for the virus. So, what was the motive?
yeah.
You
That's
know, first, and it's no conspiracy theory here. We're just trying to find out the answers, right?
sure, sure,
Um,
sure. Yeah,
as far as ESPN 30 for 30 are concerned, the person that told Tommy that he had HIV on February 10th, 1996 was Tony Holden, right? And as far as ESPN 30 for 30 are concerned, Tony Holden met Mark Ratner from the commission down at the ring, well before the fight, right?
right. For the fight.
And that has been viewed by 164 million people on just YouTube itself, in addition to ESPN selling their tape and also putting it on Disney Plus now. So now there's a problem with that, is that that scene that you saw never happened in real life.
Yeah, that's mind blowing. Like I say, yeah,
It's mind blowing because one of the questions that Mark Ratner had to answer, and this was before ESPN 30 for 30 came out, was please state with specificity all facts and identify all documents related and or concerning your ringside meeting with Tony Holden, Thomas Vergetz, the trainer, Stuart Campbell, Tony Holden's attorney, without Donking and Morrison present, which effectively cancelled Morrison's pending bout and indefinite suspension of Morrison. And the Nevada Attorney General's office responds with Mark Ratner, this responding party did not meet with Tony Holden, Thomas Verget, Stuart Campbell ringside. He never met them. In addition to that, he never said anything to them that Tommy had HIV.
that's insane. So there's all, like I say, so there's all kinds of meetings that didn't take place, information that's not correct on the records, diagnosis that's never happened. You got the judge switching up 4 different times. Like now, and somebody mentioned this in the chat. And I don't, did he piss somebody off that really had like a lot of, I mean that because that's the only that maybe had a lot of pull that could pull all these strings to make the doctors and the judge and all and all this stuff fall into place. That's the only really
Yeah.
conclusion that I can come to, because you must upset somebody that's somebody had mentioned that in the chat. I just
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, okay, I was not there. I mean, I was there in Vegas in 1996, but didn't know Tommy personally, right?
Yeah.
But I was there when he got kicked out and when the media was saying that he had HIV. I was there that day in Vegas.
Yeah.
So as far as Tommy having pissed somebody off, right? Remember, I have all his documents, right?
Yeah.
I have all the stuff that he kept.
Yeah.
I have correspondence between him, Bill Caton, correspondence between him and Sly, correspondence between him and Don King, right?
Yeah.
Correspondence between him and John Brown. I can only tell you that February 10th, 1996 is when Tommy got kicked out.
Right.
But a few months before that, Tommy had fired John Brown, his manager.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
I can only tell you that this was the first fight of a multi-million-dollar fight contract that Tommy had with Don King. Okay.
Right.
That he had signed back in September 14th, 1995. And I have the contract here. And I have all the pages. And it was about a $35 million contract because there was promise there to fight Mike Tyson for 10 million.
Yeah.
The rematch, 15 million. Another 10 million in advertising for Tommy and training expenses. It was worth a good $35 million, right? I can tell you that Tommy had his contract with Don King, but also Don King had a separate side contract with Tony Holden.
Oh, really?
And it's right here. Now, the actual contract itself, I have not seen, but here, dated January 22nd, 1996, you're scratching your head there.
I'm just soaking it all in, Miss Morrison.
Yeah, it's a lot, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's a fax. In those days, they faxed each other, right? To Don King Productions, and it is a letter from Stuart Campbell, and he is saying, the agreement by and between Don King Productions Inc. and Tommy Morrison, dated September 14th, 1995, and agreement by and between Don King Productions Inc. and Holden Productions, dated September 14th, 1995. Now, in deposition testimony, Tony Holden was not the promoter of record. He was not Tommy's manager ever. He was not Tommy manager's trainer. He, I think, called himself an advisor, but I'm not quite sure whether you can actually be under contract with the promoter and be an advisor at the same time. I haven't looked in the regulations of that. But there's evidence there that Don King had two contracts, one for Tommy and then one for Tony Holden. Also, I can show you that Tommy's opponent was Stormy Arthur Weathers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or Arthur Stormy Weathers, however you want to say it. That's who his opponent was for that fight, the first fight in Vegas that never happened. And the commission actually including exhibit TM0013 and TM0102, and it's a letter from Arthur Stormy Weather's manager to Don King, dated February 5, that Stormy Weathers was not able to fight. His physician had said that he should not fight for 2 to 3 weeks, and they filed the physician's script, which is releasing Tommy's opponent. It's dated the 2nd of February, that he was not cleared to fight by his own physician to fight.
Okay.
Yet they don't find a replacement, right? They carry on and they do the weigh-in, as everybody has seen with Don King there holding everybody's hands up.
Yeah.
They do the medical for the weigh-in, and then the person that gets kicked out is Tommy, right? So, you know, I thought that if an opponent wasn't well enough to fight, that usually the promoter gets a replacement or cancels the fight and moves it to a different day. Isn't that what normally happens?
That is what normally happens. They're rescheduled, or they find a replacement, or yeah, that's exactly what happens.
That did not happen.
Yeah, no, so so they said he wasn't. They said they both weren't cleared to fight. Then, if I follow you correctly, both him and his opponent weren't.
Well, Don King knew that Stormy Weathers was not cleared to fight by his own physician, right? He knew that 5-10 days in advance, right? Tommy was told by Tony Holden on the day of the fight that he had HIV, right?
Yeah.
For whatever reason, Don King was not involved in telling Tommy, but from deposition testimony, Tony Holden said that Don King told him to tell Tommy what was going on.
And that actually never happened. Correct? Isn't that what you said?
Right, the meeting at the ringside with the guy that supposedly gave the information about HIV, that never really happened in real life. So ESPN 30 for 30, you probably saw her, Elizabeth Merrill. She did a lot of interviews with Tommy. She did that ESPN 30 for 30.
Yeah.
She even comes out with something actually a week before Tommy dies. And she says clearly in an article for the world to read, since February 10th, 1996, when the Nevada Athletic Commission said Morrison tested positive for HIV before a fight, the 44-year-old has spent most of his days dodging the diagnosis. Well, there was no diagnosis.
Right.
And the commission never told Tommy he tested positive for a fight. And they've said it again. There's a question that the commission were asked, admit you told the media you tested him and found him positive for HIV, and Morrison tested positive for HIV. And they go, deny. We never told him that. So here you've got ESPN with their narrative out there saying that the commission had told Tommy he had tested positive, saying that Tony Holden met the commission ringside. They told Tony that Tommy had tested positive. And yet, in court records signed under oath, the commission is saying they don't practice medicine and they did not deliver a diagnosis on February 10th.
That's just strange. Like I say, there's all kind of like counteracting event. You just documents and events that happened, didn't happen. It just it just doesn't add up. Correct. It just doesn't add up, to be quite frank. That's I mean, like I say, there had to be some kind of motive or agenda or something for why they wanted to keep him out of boxing so bad, especially if he never got diagnosed with it to begin with.
Right.
and if,
And
like,
then
when you
and then
take it,
his suspension gets lifted 10 years later and nobody talks about that.
yeah, that's again, and I would just say, like, well, what the heck, like I say, and that's just the question to me, is like, what the hell was the motive to
Right,
put the stamp on him,
right,
and keep him out of the sport, and like I say, unless I could, and Don King had a lot of power in boxing back then too. So if he did something to upset him, I could imagine
right.
he probably had something to maybe had something to do with it, with the doctors and the judges and all that other type of stuff, with the false
Yeah.
information and yeah. So
Well, then what's really weird is that the press know about this before Tommy does, right? And so in another document here, um, Tony, supposedly the press is already knowing that he's going to be suspended. Get him out of here. Why? Why would you want to get Tommy Morrison out of Vegas quick? Why would you not get a physician involved, right? Tommy Morrison has just been told he's got the deadliest virus in the world and is going to die, right? But there's no physician there, right? There's no physician to tell Tommy that. Why do we have to rush Tommy out of Vegas and now take it to Tulsa, right? There's no reason for it. What should have happened was, they should have had a physician there with Tommy. They should have verified that the test actually detected the virus. They should have then done a clinical examination of Tommy, which the physician did and found him physically fit to receive a license and to box that night. And they should have asked, well, is there a regulation anyway to be tested for HIV? And had that regulation been imposed in 1996, they would have found that false positives do occur, right? People can have a false positive on a so called HIV test because it's actually what it's doing, it's showing antibodies to another disease, an autoimmune disease. But none of that happened. The blood wasn't redrawn. And in fact, the blood that was used was stored in a toxifreezer and not in room temperature, right? So, yeah, all kinds of mistakes happened. But then they carried on with the mistakes to Tulsa because somebody's bound to be asking you, well, didn't he get tested again?
yeah,
You would think,
you would
right? You
think,
would you
yeah,
would think. So he's flown out or rushed out of Vegas to Tulsa, and then he is then put in front of the cameras for another press conference. And remember, he's just turned 27, right? He's not a physician.
right,
Um, he doesn't know how to test blood. He doesn't know anything about the virus. Not many people actually did in those days. And he's been told again that he tested positive for the virus, right? Now, in February 1996, this was February 15th, 1996 now, which would be 5 days after
right,
Vegas.
right.
He's back on doing a press conference, right? And he's told to say that he's got HIV. Now, let's just take this scene, right? Can you
Yeah,
see this?
yeah. I saw it on the 30 for 30 where he was on the,
Right.
yeah.
Okay. So you've got Tony Holden and Tommy Morrison at the press conference now in Tulsa, right? And
Hmm.
that's 5 days after Vegas. Above that, you've got Magic Johnson and his doctor, Dr. Ho,
Hmm.
right? So again, you have no physician standing next to Tommy, right? And supposedly Dr. Ho did testing on Tommy. And as part of the record on this lawsuit, I contacted Dr. David Ho and asked him for the medical records on Tommy, and they had been destroyed, right?
What?
So when Tommy when Tommy stands up in front of the press in Tulsa after the second test, right?
I was just gonna,
Um,
I was just gonna say, not to interrupt you or anything, Miss Morrison.
yeah,
This was the second test after he had initially had supposedly after the first one, right? Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Yeah. So this
yeah,
is now the further testing. Everybody always says, well, okay, well, all right, so he didn't have HIV in Vegas, never got diagnosed in Vegas. Did he have another test to verify that? Well, yeah, and I'm still looking for that test, right?
yeah.
Dr. Ho has destroyed his medical records, right? But it wasn't Dr. Ho that did the testing for this conference on February 15th. It was Dr. James Hutton, right? So now there's court records now on Dr. James Hutton, who did the test, right, for February 15th um, press conference, where Tommy stands up there, says, look at me, I'm not a role model anymore,
Oh,
I've had a promiscuous lifestyle. Guy is only just 27, right? And he's
yeah,
already had this huge promiscuous lifestyle.
yeah.
Um, okay, let me read you what a document filed in court records. Records from Dr. James Hutton, an infectious disease specialist with Tulsa Infectious Disease Clinic in Tulsa, show that he initially examined the claimant, which is Tommy, on March 5, 1996.
Okay, so that's before everything then,
That's after
or after?
everything.
Excuse me. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
All right, so February 10, Tommy, you've got HIV, says Tony Holden in Vegas, right? February 15, he tells Tommy again he's got HIV to go into the press conference because Dr. Hutton and not even Dr. Ho yet had received blood. But Dr. James Hutton hadn't actually seen Tommy until March 5, which is way after February 15th,
Yeah,
right?
a couple
Um,
of weeks after, right? Yeah.
yeah, at which time Dr. Hutton said that Tommy Morrison had been found to be HIV positive during testing that was performed in Nevada prior to a heavyweight boxing match that the claimant was scheduled to participate in. In other words, Dr. Hutton is using the results from Vegas,
He's using,
right?
right. So in fact, so he's using the results from February for the one in March.
For not even, yeah, as
Yeah,
well, yeah.
right.
So on February 10th, nobody diagnosed Tommy with HIV. On February 15th, there was no test result to diagnose Tommy again with HIV. And then you've got two other doctors' names that come into the books that are out there on Tommy, Dr. Epps and Dr. Wilkinson. Well, neither of them are physicians in the field of virology and microbiology. They have nothing to do with HIV.
Yeah.
Um, and then the other guy that is in ESPN 30 for 30, his
I'm,
name
yeah.
is Dr. Bodner. And funnily enough, I mean, you've got Trisha here, you've got John, Johnny on little name tags on this interview.
Yeah.
The only guy that they don't give a name tag to is this guy in the white coat, Dr. Bodner. And he apparently explains to Tommy that he's doing great. He's taking the medications great, and but he's using a test that does not detect HIV and was not FDA approved until July of 1996, not February of 1996. And then you've got another doctor, Dr. Nemechek, which Tony Holden found was, I guess, a friend of Tony Holden's, who is actually an osteopath. He's nothing to do with being an HIV/AIDS expert, right?
Yeah.
So, and then of course you've got Dr. John Hyatt, who is actually a toxicologist and not a physician in HIV. So Tommy actually never really got to see anybody that retested him for autoimmune disorders that would trigger a false positive until 2012.
Wow.
And
And that,
that's when,
yeah, and that's getting close to the end there too.
yeah,
Right.
that's right. Um, so, all the stuff at the beginning, the ESPN 30 for 30 show
Hmm.
just does not jive with court records. And, what
Yeah.
can you do?
Now I have a question. Okay. Now, are you on good terms with his brother and his? I don't know if his mom's still around, but and his mom and his fan,
Um, no, not really, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And his, um, yeah, I didn't marry Tommy's family. I hate to say that. I married Tommy, right? And nothing against his mother. His mother's a sweet 80-year-old lady,
Yeah.
right? She's not a physician.
Right.
I feel sorry for her. She's a tough lady. She was with Tommy during his early career, you
Yeah.
know, forging his age so that he could
Yeah.
fight at the age of 13 in tough men contests.
Right.
Um, so no, I don't hang out with Timmy Morrison, or up until I would say about 2 months ago, his mom and I would text, yeah,
Yeah.
and she'd call me part of the family, which I thought was really nice.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and the only reason I ask is because they have the same belief as you that a lot of this is bullshit. With the diagnosis and him having HIV. Are they in the same boat as you with believing that this is a bunch of
Right.
Yeah.
Well, something interesting happened, Johnny. It was about a month and a half ago. Tony Holden had an attorney send me a cease and desist,
Okay.
right? And in other words, to stop me doing these interviews, to stop me showing these documents that are in court records, that I was to cease and desist, right, from doing this, which I thought was really strange
Yeah.
for him to do that. And he incorporated a few of the ex-family members, like Tommy's ex-wife, second ex-wife, not the first one,
Yeah.
and Timmy the brother,
Yeah.
and so I responded back within probably about a week after a shock. Um, I didn't know how to contact the attorney because he had no mailing address on the cease and desist letter. Nothing was on the envelope. It was basically greetings, cease and desist now, warm regards. And it's like, what kind of a cease and desist letter is this?
Yeah. Right.
Um, so when I finally looked up who the attorney was, young kid, just got his license. That's great, but comes from a big firm. And when I started to look into the firm, I found out that there was actually the lawsuit that they're representing Tony Holden in, right, which has been out since 2019, and it's a lawsuit that the Peoria tribe of Indians of Oklahoma are filing against Tony Holden. And so I was like in shock because I'd never read it. Nobody had told me about it. I'd heard about it just slightly, but people had said it had already been closed. And it's the Indian tribe, saying that there was a misappropriation of $2.1 million, right?
Hmm.
That Tony Holden and his partner had embezzled while running Buffalo Run Casino in Oklahoma. So I was shocked to find that out, right, while I was trying to respond to a cease and desist to him.
Yeah.
And so one of my questions to the attorney was, are you wanting me to cease and desist because none of this evidence or court records makes it look that Tony Holden is a good guy, right? That's not my fault, right? I am showing you what court records are. But at the same time, I'd be happy, for example, in this interview, Johnny, to
Yeah.
be able to say, here is the post-mortem that Tony Holden gave me that shows he had HIV/AIDS, right?
Yeah.
Here is the name of the doctor that told him that Tommy had HIV in February. I asked all those questions, right?
Mm.
Provide me that information, and I would be happy to, on my next interview, show all that, right? Right now, all
Yeah.
I can do is show this doctor, Dr. Nielsen from Boston, who did Tommy's antemortem in July 2012, showing no HIV. It's on the record, right?
Yeah.
That's his antemortem. All I can do right now is show Dr. Philip Smith, who was the infectious disease physician, head of the department in Nebraska, that called me and told me Tommy was negative for HIV.
Yeah.
All I can do is show Johnny, right, Dr. Stephen Hendricks, who did the post-mortem on Tommy, who had worked with Dr. Anthony Fauci in the early 80s at the start of HIV, and who then authored for Tommy his post-mortem report showing scientifically that Tommy did not have HIV. That's all I can show, right? And if Tony Holden, Tommy's mom, Tommy's brother can show me a post-mortem, right, can show me even a photo, right, of Tommy's blood, because the physicians and scientists went that far.
Yeah.
Even show me a photo of Tommy's blood infested with the virus, right? I'd be happy to share it with you today, Johnny.
Right. But there's nothing there. Right.
Nothing,
Yeah, I mean, and
nothing.
yeah, another guy in the comment, my buddy, he said, yeah, it seems like the Tony Holden had a lot to do with, a lot of the BS that went on, with the records and, you know,
Well, he did,
yeah, yeah, it's clear as
and
day. It's clear as,
it's clear as day. I mean, one thing you don't do if you're not a physician, you don't tell somebody they're going to die, right? You
no,
don't tell somebody they've got HIV without any support whatsoever. Where did he get that information from when it's clear in court records the Nevada Commission never told him that,
and
right?
yeah, and the Tony Holden also had something going on with Don King, if I heard that correctly a little while.
Yes, he
Okay.
had he had his own contract directly with Don King, which Tommy said he knew nothing about at the time when Tommy found out.
Oh wow. Well, I mean, I think it's kind of safe to say that those two were in cahoots a little bit with all of this,
Yeah,
all the shit that went on. I mean,
yeah.
yeah,
I don't know. I mean, maybe one day you can call, Tony Holden onto the show and just say, Tony, who told you he had HIV? You're telling everybody that he died of AIDS and he had HIV. Show us the post-mortem, right? You know, just show us some proof of that from somebody that did his post-mortem report, right? Because what I did is I followed the science, not the sweet science, right?
yeah,
So as much as you're going down the road of how did this happen, right?
yeah,
You're going down the road of promoters, managers, all that stuff. That's the sweet science, right?
mhm,
I'm going down the road of science, right? In a way, I feel sorry for Tony Holden because he didn't know anything about HIV, right? So,
yeah,
he never had Tommy tested for any of the other diseases that
mhm,
could cause a false positive, right? I did. I had Tommy tested for all the diseases that would cause a false positive. And in fact, I have them right here, right?
Yeah.
Because people are going to say, okay, so if Tommy didn't have HIV, didn't have AIDS, what did he die of, right? Well,
I was just going to say, not to interrupt you. I was just going to say, because I heard you on the other interview that I watched with you previous.
yeah,
Why don't you tell everybody what he really died of?
yeah,
Okay.
I will.
Yeah.
And one thing that he did not die of is he did not die of AIDS, right? First of all, he obviously never got diagnosed in 96 with HIV. So the narrative that he died of AIDS in 2013 because he got diagnosed with HIV doesn't stand anymore, right?
Right.
Um, I investigated the science of it to try and find out what happened. You know, what's going on with Tommy's body here. I turned to Dr. Anthony Fauci, who some people agree with, some people don't, right? But Dr. Anthony Fauci said that to have AIDS, if you've been diagnosed with HIV, means that you have to have PCP, which is pneumocystis carini pneumonia, and Kaposi sarcoma, right? That is the definition classified as having AIDS if you have PCP and KS for short, right? Was Tommy ever tested for PCP or KS by anybody? And the answer to that is no. But he was tested in 2012. Dr. Riley tested his tissue, no KP, right? Then Dr. Bauman tested him for PCP in June and August while Tommy was still alive, no PCP. Then you've got Dr. Heasty, who tested Tommy for CMV, which is another AIDS defining diseases, came back negative. Dr. Steckelberg tested him for histoplasmosis, no AIDS. Pesano tested him for the JCP virus, which is all AIDS defining diseases, negative for that JCP virus. Dr. Kozel tested Tommy again for Kaposi sarcoma in July of 2013. That's 2 months before Tommy died.
Right.
No Kaposi sarcoma. Then Dr. Radio tested him for pneumocystis carini. Dr. Rudersdorf tested him, no opportunistic pneumonia. Dr. Bongo tested him for JCP virus, all negative. These guys tested him for everything to rule out AIDS, and they ruled it out. Now, what was wrong with Tommy? Why could he possibly test positive on an FDA-approved HIV test? Well, inside the packets for these tests, there are disclaimers. There's like buying an aspirin, bottle of aspirin.
Yeah.
There's always a little packet on the side to say, you know, these are the side effects or whatever, right?
Don't take if you're pregnant, you know. Right.
Exactly. That's right. Well, first of all, going back to the Nevada Commission, there's a document here, docket 146, and the commission said that they have no knowledge of the possibility of false positives, right? So they didn't know in 1996 that anybody could even test a false positive. Almost kind of like COVID, you know that you can test a false positive on COVID tests.
Yeah.
That's the same thing with HIV. This gentleman here, his name is Dr. David Einspar. His specialty was hematology, which is blood. And he tested Tommy for Coombs positive, which is a hemolytic anemia, right? Which is a special blood disorder. And Coombs positive will make you test false positive on the tests, right?
Okay.
And here is a science paper dated 2019 that says Coombs positive people will test false positive. So if Tommy tested positive on any tests and they didn't rule out the fact that he had Coombs positive, then basically they thought that the antibodies that they were looking at belonged to HIV, when in fact they didn't. They belonged to Coombs positive.
Oh wow. And you had, and like you were saying, you had the 8 or 10 different doctors test him for all that other stuff, and he came up negative
Yeah.
every.
Yeah,
That's
he came up negative. They even photographed his blood. They even looked at his cerebral spine fluid, which contains everything in there.
yeah,
His macrophages inside his lungs, his sputum, his sperm, blood, and they found no virus at all. And in fact, the CDC comes out with something that says false positive HIV tests. And they say, this is the CDC, this is what I mean. I went to the CDC, the FDA, not to, you know, Don King or Tony Holden. And it says false positive test results can occur due to technical issues associated with the test or biological causes. There can be specimen mix-up, there can be mislabeling, there can be improper handling, misinterpretation of the results. Biological causes include participation in an HIV vaccine study or autoimmune disorders. So you can test positive, but what it is, it's a false positive,
yeah,
right?
right.
And Tommy never actually had the whole virus in his body to have ever been contagious. And none of the physicians between 1996 and 2012 ever tested Tommy for all the other diseases that would trigger a false positive. So Tommy's downfall really was he came out of jail
Mm,
in 2011. He was in a felony fugitive warrant of arrest in Tennessee over what was found out to be an $80 unpaid fine from South Dakota of 2006. I mean, the story is very bizarre, Johnny.
yeah,
And
I can tell. Yeah.
he was thrown into jail for 30 days. He lost about 30 pounds and he came out with an insect bite to the side of his chest. All
Oh,
right.
yeah.
Nobody on ESPN has even come out with that. They didn't give it any time that they should have done. This is the physician, Dr. Antonio Ossio. He's the physician that we took Tommy to after Tommy got released from jail
Uh-huh.
on bond. And he even writes something up, which is in court records, where it states on September 29th, 2011, he saw Tommy Morrison in his office. He had a large abscess in his right axilla, which was the result of an insect bite, probably a spider, that had occurred a few days prior to his visit on the 29th.
Yeah.
It was necessary to drain the abscess at that time. And he puts that in an affidavit, files that in court as well,
Mm,
also files that he never diagnosed Tommy with HIV, never found HIV in Tommy.
right.
And these are real pictures. That's the abscess in Tommy's chest when he came out of jail.
Man.
Okay.
Yeah.
When we took Tommy for surgery, after Dr. Ossio had drained, Tommy went into surgery on December 1, 2011, and
Mm-hmm.
it was supposed to be a 1 hour surgery, and he came out about 5-6 hours later, and we didn't leave the hospital for 8 days.
Wow.
It was horrendous. We arrived home on December 8th, and Tommy was a completely different person. He wasn't able to drive. It was almost like he was in septic shock, and in actuality, he was. The next day, the home health lady came and she took off the bandage and that's the side of his chest. And I'm going to reenact this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just so you can see the gravity of it. But she took, this is the little bandage that she was going to change. So she took that off, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, hey, there's something still in his chest. And she said, no, no, no. All I've got to do is put a new bandage on there. And I said, no, no, no. There's something in there. And sticking out of his chest, right, was 12 foot of surgical gauze that had been tightly packed into Tommy's chest, right, and had been left there for 8 days after surgery. This obviously was not white. Okay, this is a clean piece of surgical gauze. It
Yeah.
was covered in blood with blood clots. It
Oh,
smelled absolutely horrible that when the nurse had finished pulling it out, she almost passed out on the sofa. And this kept on coming out. And this was all tightly packed in Tommy's chest, right? And more and more and more. And I want you to see this because this was in Tommy's chest,
yeah.
tightly packed. Nobody could have survived this. In fact, he survived it for 21 months. He was in and out of septic shock. He was actually diagnosed with sepsis. Um, when the gauze had been found, and I took pictures, that's his chest, and I'm pointing to it, and I'm going, there's something in there, right? And again, the nurse said, no, there's nothing documented, but yes, there's something in there. And when the gauze came out, that was his chest.
Oh man.
You could fit your whole hand inside his chest. And Tommy was, I mean, just such a brave guy, right? You
Well,
know, he took the bashes from Ray Mercer, you know, and Lennox Lewis,
Big George. Big George.
Big George, Michael Bent, right?
Yeah.
Never cried in the ring, but that night his leg gave way, his right leg gave way at the same side as his chest wound, and he did go straight through a wall with a sheetrock, and he fell on the side of his neck, and that was the beginning of the downfall,
Yeah.
right, of Tommy Morrison. Nothing to do with HIV, AIDS. Um, and we didn't find out till probably about 6 months later that he had paralyzed half his voice box. So it meant that as he was trying to eat and drink, it would cause aspiration pneumonia because it would go straight into his lungs. Um, there's one scene where Tony Holden says, Trisha, you know, what do you think's wrong with Tommy? And I go, it's that insect bite.
Yeah.
And he looks as if he's in disgust of me, saying, no, you know, what insect bite?
What a
And,
jerk.
you know, and I've got proof here of when that physician drained it. I've also got proof that, you know, the actual wound did heal,
Yeah.
right? Almost 12 months to the day, no matter Tommy was fighting septic shock, septicemia, the wound healed. But the septic shock and the septicemia was already in his blood, and no antibiotics could get rid of that septicemia. This is the physician that diagnosed him with sepsis. Um, and people are going to say, well, why didn't you do something about that malpractice then? I did. I tried, right? I tried with the Tennessee Medical Board. I tried, and they lost the paperwork. I filed it again with them, and they said, you're out of time. You've only got 12 months. And by that time, we were already out of Tennessee.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, and for anybody that's never been incarcerated before, there's always a lot of nasty stuff floating around in there, and germs and people that don't clean themselves, and just
Yeah,
all of that, bugs, like and all of that stuff. It's a filthy environment. You got to make the best of it when you're in there, of course, obviously, and wash yourself, and but it's a very filthy scummy
Yeah.
advice too, and even I'll tell you this too. I mean, obviously this isn't as big of a a big of a thing. When I broke my hand, I I had it wrapped up and I had the pins in my hand and all that stuff. I was still going to work and I worked at a warehouse at the time. So I was still lifting stuff with my broken hand. And the lady told me, just leave the gauze on there for like a week or something. And I'm like, well, shouldn't I be changing this
Yeah.
every day? Because I'm getting, I'm touching stuff at work, dust and moving pallets and all. And she's like, no, just leave it on there for a couple of weeks. So then it got infected.
Yeah.
And then I had to have another surgery. I ended up in the hospital. I had to have a PIC line that goes to
Right.
the vein, and I had to
Yeah.
pump. So people, listen to what the doctor says. But if you got questions and you got a bad injury, man, question it.
Right.
Call them up, badger them if you got it, dude. It's your health too.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the downfall.
Yeah.
And people always want to think, well, he got diagnosed with HIV in 96, he died of AIDS. But wait, there's actually the true story out there. He never got diagnosed and he was tested for AIDS and he's got a postmortem showing no HIV or AIDS. Then they have to start believing what they're seeing now, right? Um, so yeah, there's jail. Tommy hated being in prison. He actually would cry. He said, "I just don't want to go back into jail."
Yeah.
And so that last time that he was in jail, you probably saw that mugshot, right?
Yeah.
That's all out there. That was the mugshot of Tommy getting out of jail, right?
Mhm.
After 30 days, he was in prison in Tennessee for 3 weeks, and he was then extradited on a private jet, right, from Tennessee to Kansas, thrown into a cell with 5 gang members, really bad gang members of Wichita, and of course, Tommy throws a left hook, right, in self-defense, right, and he gets taken out of that cell. He gets put into what's called a disciplinary cell,
Or
and
solitary.
solitary. The night before he's in front of the media, um, no blankets, no nothing. He said he slept on the floor. They didn't attend to his chest wound that was already in bad shape because I got the medical records from the jail. They never looked at that. And then even once Tommy got out of jail, he was arrested 3 more times, Johnny, on the way home,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
3 more times. He got arrested at Walmart for loitering, trying to wear sunglasses at the sunglass stand. He got arrested on a Delta Airlines flight for supposedly having drugs on him and in him. But then they drug tested him at Atlanta Airport, found he was clean, so they put him on the last flight. And then when I picked him up at Knoxville Airport, um, that next morning he drove me to work. I worked at the Hard Rock Cafe in Gatlinburg, and he dropped me off at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then drove home. I got a call from the jail and saying that he's back in jail again on a DUI.
Right.
Right. This is all in the span of 3 days. Right. And they drew his blood. They did the alcohol testing or whatever,
Yeah.
and the results came back a week later. No alcohol in him, nothing. He was literally a cop magnet, right?
Yeah. And once you get some law enforcement upset at you, and I know this personally too, they're going to have a vendetta against you and they're going to try to nail you for every little thing, even if you're not doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
They're going to try and make it look like you did.
Yeah.
You know.
And with Tommy though, the cops actually loved him, right?
Yeah.
And they basically were after a free autograph. There was one time when Tommy was late coming back from lunch, and when he came back, he was followed by 5 cop cars, right? I had to call the mayor and say, "What is going on here?" Well, he looked suspicious, right, at the Quick Trip, getting a cup of coffee in July wearing his beanie, right?
Oh,
That was enough suspicion to try and arrest him.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
I can you excuse me for 1 second, Miss Morrison? I just got to
Yeah.
use the restroom real quick. Okay.
Right.
All right.
Okay. So anyway, so we've got the whole show for ourselves now. So I'm going to carry on while Johnny is in the restroom, right? And I want to introduce you to another lady called Dr. Michelle Owen, and she is from the CDC, and she says that it is possible to have low CD4 counts if you have other diseases, right? So whether they tested Tommy for CD4 and he had a low or a high count, it did not mean that he had HIV. And then also on the viral load test, she also says that the first HIV viral load test to be FDA approved was the Roche Amplicor HIV monitor. It came on the market June, July of 1996. If the testing was done prior to this time in 1996, it would not have been it would have been a non-FDA approved research use test. In any situation, viral load tests are not actually approved for screening and making a diagnosis of HIV. So I don't know if you got all that, did you?
No, I had to walk in. I made the bathroom quick, real. But um,
But yeah, there's just more proof there. That CD4 counts and viral load tests also don't mean that you have HIV or AIDS. You have to look further and do further testing. So, which is what we did for Tommy. And now it's just getting the truth out there. I'm really excited, Johnny, because a couple of nights ago I was contacted by somebody who's got 3.3 million viewers, right?
yeah.
And this would be tremendous to get that out on that particular show. So hope you're going to pray for that for me.
Oh yeah. Of course I will, Miss Morrison. Yeah. I even somebody in the chat mentioned earlier you should do a documentary of your own if you have the means to do so. Because it's a big
Yeah,
lot of misconceptions, a lot of misinformation. It's just a big spider web almost.
right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, a documentary is being pitched to me out there. So
Oh, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Enough said. Say no more. Say no more.
yeah,
No more. Well, you know, I'll go ahead and I'll ask people in the chat if you got any questions. Now's the time. I wanted to let Mrs. Morrison talk and get her stuff for get her, get the information out there and say what she needed to say, and would along with me asking a few questions. So if anybody in the chat's got some questions, now's the time for it. You know, but I will. After we end this and everything, I'm going to give you my phone number so you can just if you feel like calling or texting or get wanting to come back on. You're always more than welcome to.
yeah,
I mostly just talk my boxing on here and stuff. So yeah,
yeah.
feel free. You know,
That's nice of you, and I really appreciate it. I value people like you who do these podcasts and are unafraid, right, to help get this information out there. I think that's really important. I think that just speaks volumes when and answers Tommy's questions. When he said, I fought for my fans. Would they fight for me? And that's what you're doing for him right now.
Yeah, of course. And like I say, he's kind of me and him kind of got a little similar stories. Well, I don't want to say exactly, but
Yeah,
we hit a lot of the same beats. So I understand it, and like I say, I understand being labeled falsely, and
yeah,
having a people having a misconception about you, and thinking you're a bad person when you're not, and being treated like a leopard, and some of the stuff you stated
yeah.
before, and so my friend of mine just wanted to ask, what do you think of his kids fighting?
Kenzie is a great fighter. Kenzie actually trained with Tommy in his gym in Wichita. And Tommy was just blown away, saying, Kenzie is a natural and has a lot of power. And when you see Kenzie fighting, he's got a lot of his dad in him, a lot of heart.
Yeah,
So it's a tough business to be in. You've got the YouTube fighters out there that are earning millions and millions of dollars, right? And then the regular old school type boxers that are in the thousands, right?
yeah. Well, and see, to me, Mrs. Morrison, that's kind of crap, because you got, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again. You've got guys that have been trying to do this and trying to make it since they're 5, 6, 7 years old.
Yeah,
And these kids come along that never had to really work for anything, and they get paid. But like, come on, man, that's kind of BS to me. So, and I've said that before. I mean, I don't think Jake Paul could beat me if I was in shape. To be to be to, to be quite honest with you. So,
yeah. But
but
he sells a lot of tickets,
yeah,
pay per view, which is all part of it, right?
that's absolutely all part of it. So,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah,
Well, all right, Mrs. Morrison. Well, I appreciate you coming by and everything. I enjoyed talking to you. And like I said, if you ever want to come back on, please feel free. I'll give you my number I'll message you the number in case you feel like getting in touch or anything. And I very,
yeah,
very much enjoyed it. And I appreciate you stopping by and everything. It was very nice to hear from.
yeah.
And I'm
Well,
glad.
thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome, and it was nice of you nice of you for, and I'm happy you reached out, because I love doing this kind of stuff. This kind of,
Good,
yeah,
good. Well, I'll definitely get that out there because this interview really covers quite a bit, not only on the medical side and the HIV/AIDS stuff, but also on the drug side and prison time. And I think a lot of people need to hear that part of Tommy's life too.
yeah, and again, like I say, that's a tough thing to crawl out of, man. I've had to do it, and unfortunately, a lot of people stick you
Yeah,
with that label for a long time. So it's a hard shadow to crawl out from under.
right.
So,
Yeah.
but all right, Mrs. Morrison.
All
Well,
right. Well,
thank
thank you.
Yeah.
And we'll be in touch, and I really appreciate it.
Okay, ma'am. You have a nice afternoon.
All right. You take care, Johnny.
Oh,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that. And I'm going to try to get some more people on it. Yeah. Yeah, that was nice, wasn't it, Tycho? Well, it was nice, wasn't it, Tycho? Now yeah, that was nice, wasn't it, Tycho? So, just a little change of pace there for you know. Thanks, 150. I wasn't, hey, by the way, I wasn't ignoring everybody in the chat, but I wanted to pay attention to her and what she had to say. I'm trying to, that's a lot of ins and outs of that whole story. And there's a lot of freaking, a lot of, it's a big spider web. So I wanted to pay attention to what she was saying. Wasn't ignoring you guys in the chat or anything, but in the same breath, I had to listen. I had to listen instead of talk. So I wanted to listen to what she was saying. I wanted to hear what she had to say and everything. So I wasn't ignoring nobody in the chat, but in the same breath, when I'm talking to somebody, if I have a guest like that, I want to soak up all the information and that I can get. So yeah, that wound was terrible. I didn't even know that. I didn't even know that, dude. That thing was freaking awful, man. But all right, fellas, I'll talk to you later, man. I just thought I'd get that out there for everybody. God bless you all. Thank everybody for tuning in, and I'll talk to you next time. Take care.